And now please welcome artist Nneka Jones.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Nneka Jones, and today I'll be talking to you about the power of art and the use of my artwork to make a social impact. So, I actually grew up in Trinidad and Tobago. I am originally from the Caribbean. And as you can see in the image on the left, I look like I'm in that happy bubble. I didn't see anything outside of the Caribbean. I felt like I didn't know anything existed outside of the Caribbean. And so I almost felt like I was immersed in the culture, the people, the music, and of course, the food. You can't go to the Caribbean and not love Caribbean food. So I actually visited Trinidad and Tobago, different artists that had different studios. And in there, I almost felt like I wasn't an artist yet, or I didn't consider myself an artist. I almost felt like I was a creative. And that creativity sparked some sort of curiosity within me. And that allowed me to want to see what other artists were doing, see how they were kind of experimenting with portraiture, experimenting with the Caribbean culture, and learn about their process and their way of making in their studios. So this was actually the artwork that I started to create, and when I started to come into my own artistic skin, I felt like I needed to capture different moments and different times within Caribbean culture, and doing that by pairing it with things that we would often see. So that tropical nature of flora and fauna, those flamboyant colors, the vibrancy of just the scene itself. But something still felt like it was missing. So I continued to work for a while, and I worked really hard because I started to develop that passion. So that curiosity was there, the creativity was there, the passion was developing. And this image is actually me. You can see me on the right. I know there looks like there's nothing on my paper, but I was actually hard at work at the University of Tampa. So I worked so hard in Trinidad that I was actually able to burst that bubble of seeing the Caribbean only. And I started to see other cultures, the United States, the UK. And that allowed me to get a scholarship from the national government in Trinidad and Tobago, and I chose to study at the University of Tampa. So I started to learn a lot more about the traditional practices as an artist, the traditional tools. We would have different workshops, and I really felt like, okay, I can call myself an artist now. So this is me in my studio as I started to get a lot more comfortable. It was my first time working in oil paint because I initially started off working with acrylics, with clay, as I showed in the previous slide. And as much as I loved that I was able to capture portraiture, I still had those fumes from solvents, and the working environment almost felt like I wasn't being sustainable as an artist. So I really started to question my material and how I was translating that within the studio just for myself. And so I actually decided to work with embroidery. This was the first time that I was actually picking up thread and sewing a portrait rather than actually painting it. So it was a huge challenge for me. But you'll see how my work kind of evolved over time to where as I got more comfortable, I felt more comfortable sharing more messages with deeper meaning through my portraiture. And so I was able to step outside of my comfort zone, bursting another bubble of being in that traditional artist format and using only traditional materials such as paints and solvents and oil paints to now a contemporary approach to using thread and fiber art and fabrics. So as much as I was adventurous, I didn't want to venture out into trying to do someone else's face, so I actually did my face first. So this is actually photos from my first ever embroidered portrait, and that was the first stitch. I'm glad that I captured that. And I just kind of started experimenting with doing different stitches and seeing how it would translate on the canvas. that challenge was I wasn't able to use paints to mix the color that I wanted, but I really enjoyed the process of forcing myself to step outside of my comfort zone and creating a color palette with just using thread. So as you can see, I got a lot more comfortable with it. And from there, I started to realize, okay, I'm not just creating artwork that's representative of a face, and it can hang on a gallery wall, and it can look pretty. There's something more powerful about each stitch that I'm creating. There's something that people are able to connect with when I do the eyes, with that stare or that gaze. And I started paying a lot more attention to the colors that I was using and how that can interact with emotions and your mind. And I also started playing a lot more with symbolism, so the use of targets. So this was part of my target series where I focused on raising awareness about victims of sexual abuse. And my work kind of continued to evolve. So you'll see this is now my second self-portrait. The difference between the techniques that I used in the beginning and now translating to this, you would probably think that those details were painted, but you can see the progress of my work over time. So one is the back of the canvas on the left and the front of the canvas. And this piece was acquired by the Tampa Museum of Art for their permanent collection. And it felt so good to see that my non-traditional use and my non-traditional approach was not only recognized in my community, among students in my class, of course, my family, who would tell me that my work looks good, even when it doesn't, but for it to be recognized by a museum and for it to be collected by a museum, I knew that there was power in this thread work that I was creating. And so I started to push myself a little bit more, going larger in scale and removing paints completely. So in my previous embroidered pieces, I would embroider the face and then kind of have the background painted in acrylic. So I wasn't necessarily using oils, but I tried removing it completely and just doing fabric and thread. So in these, it's just fabric and thread. And I also started posting a lot more on social media so that I can raise awareness about the non-traditional approach that I was using, but also just as a solo artist, not being represented by a gallery. And I'm glad that I did that because an art director from Time magazine had actually seen one of my embroidered pieces, and he thought that it was a painting. And so I got an email, and I thought it was a scam at first. Like, this can't be real. But it actually was real, and so I ended up doing the cover of Time for August 2020, a hand-embroidered American flag. And that's when I truly noticed, okay, your work is not just powerful among friends and family, among the Tampa Bay community. This is global, and you're making a difference with using a different medium, but it's also more sustainable for you as an artist working in your studio. And it also helps people to kind of slow down, pause, look at the piece, notice that, okay, those aren't pencil marks or those aren't paint strokes. The needle is still left in the canvas on the cover of Time magazine. So I really started to kind of push the boundaries with where I was going with my artwork. And I couldn't stop there. I felt like I needed to revisit the paintings that I was doing, and on a much larger scale, outside of just being in my studio. I knew that my hands and my passion for art was longing for something just outside of the studio and where I could involve community. So I started working with paint brands that were more sustainable and environmentally friendly. And as much as it takes me a lot more layers and a lot longer time to finish the piece, it still creates beautiful artwork. This piece was a collaborative piece called The Global Currency, focusing on overfishing and different environmental issues that we don't often feel comfortable talking about as a society. And sometimes it can be boring for some people. But art creates that in-your-face effect, or it acts as a vehicle where people are like, okay, something is happening here, or something is important, or the colors are drawing me in. And again, it forces them to pause and slow down. This piece is actually in East Boston. So it was my first time in Boston, and I'm afraid of heights. So I actually did not include any of the images when I was on the lift because you might see some tears. But I'm really proud of this piece because it was almost like a full circle moment where this piece is actually at a school. So little Nneka that was on the back of that car in Trinidad, and then going to school, going to high school in Trinidad and working my way up to now creating murals in Boston, but not just for the fact that it's pretty and I'm getting to paint on the side of a building, but because I know the global impact, the impacts within the community, and the legacy that I'm leaving behind for different generations, and it being at a school, it was really important and something that I'm extremely proud of. So if you ever go to East Boston, you can go check this out. It's at the Donald McKay K-8 school. And that's it, if you guys would like to follow me.